Northern Manitoba, Canada, October 1951. While experienced trappers across the pass region spent autumn preparing standard emergency gear, waterproof match containers, wool blankets, and materials for lean-to construction, Swedish immigrant Viktor Bergström was spending 3 weeks in the bush, practicing something that made his neighbors shake their heads in disbelief. He was digging elaborate pits in the snow, 8 feet deep with L-shaped entrance tunnels, angled at exactly 90 degrees to the prevailing northwest winds. At the October gathering at Henderson's trading post, Frank Whitmore watched Victor demonstrate his technique and called it what everyone was thinking. "You're digging your own grave before winter even starts," Whitmore said, his voice carrying the weight of 25 years surviving Manitoba winters. "That's Scandinavian foolishness that'll get you killed in a real blow." Victor didn't argue. His weathered hands, scarred by 12 years working trap lines and temperatures that could freeze spit before it hit the ground, continued measuring the precise angle of his practice entrance tunnel. The 47-year-old Swede had grown up among the Sami people of northern Sweden, learning survival methods refined through 10,000 winters before matches or steel tools existed. But here in Manitoba, his knowledge made him an outsider among men who believed fire and experience were the only things standing between a trapper and death. Robert McKinnon, a Scottish trapper who'd worked these territories for 8 years, stood between Victor's quiet certainty and Frank's vocal skepticism. "Never seen anyone survive 3 days out without fire in a Manitoba whiteout," Max said, watching Victor pack snow blocks to demonstrate wall construction. "Not saying it can't be done, just saying I've never seen it done." The youngest of the group, Jean-Paul Duchesne, a French-Canadian eager to prove himself on his second season, listened carefully but kept his questions to himself. Challenging Frank Whitmore's authority wasn't how you earned respect among northern trappers. Victor's demonstration drew a crowd of 12 men, most of them shaking their heads at the complexity. He explained how the pit had to be excavated below the snow surface for wind protection, with the sleeping platform built 18 inches higher than the entrance so cold air would sink away from the body. "In Sapmi, we survived without fire when wood was wet or wind too strong," Victor said in his thick accent. "Body heat alone keeps you alive if the shelter's right." Frank's response came quick and sharp. "Theory dies in practice when you're freezing, Victor. Fire is what saves you. Fire and experience." The physics seemed sound when Victor explained it. Snow provided an R value of 1 per inch of thickness, meaning 8-foot walls delivered R96 insulation, superior to any wood structure. The human body generated 100 watts of heat at rest, and an 8 cubic meter snow pit required only 30 watts to maintain above freezing temperatures. The L-shaped entrance prevented wind from penetrating the chamber while maintaining air pressure that sealed warmth inside. But numbers on a calm October afternoon meant nothing to men who'd watched trappers freeze to death, despite doing everything the experienced way. The stakes were clear to everyone at Henderson's. Trapline territories stretched 40 miles between cabins, 3 to 4 days of travel through country that could turn lethal in hours. Standard emergency protocol had kept most men alive for decades. Find shelter, build a fire, construct a lean-to from spruce boughs, and wait for the weather to break. Victor's method required no fire, no matches, nothing but a folding snow saw, a collapsible shovel, and knowledge most of these men considered foreign superstition. When Victor prepared to head out for his late November trap run, Frank's parting words carried the certainty of a man who'd buried friends. "Hope we don't find you frozen in one of those pits come spring, Victor." The weather forecast called for unsettled conditions developing across the northern territories. December brought the first significant test of competing survival philosophies. 18 inches of snow, driven by 30-mile-per-hour winds, and temperatures that plunged to 25 below zero. Frank Whitmore found himself 8 miles from his cabin when the storm hit, and his response followed 25 years of proven technique. He constructed a standard A-frame lean-to using spruce boughs and dead timber, established a fire pit with careful stone placement, and gathered enough firewood to maintain flames through the night. The shelter took 45 minutes to build, and Frank considered that time well spent. His fire provided interior temperatures hovering between 15 and 20 degrees, dropping to 10 below whenever he let the flames die to coals. Sleep became impossible without tending the fire every 2 hours, rising from his bedroll to feed wood into flames that seemed to consume fuel faster than he could gather it. Victor's response to the same storm revealed a different mathematics of survival. 22 miles northeast, he began excavating his emergency pit as wind-driven snow stung his face like needles. 90 minutes later, working methodically despite the cold that made his lungs ache with each breath, he completed a 6-foot chamber with a sleeping platform elevated precisely above the entrance tunnel. No fire flickered in Victor's shelter because fire was impossible. The slightest flame would melt the walls and destroy the thermal integrity that made the design work. Instead, his body heat alone warmed the 8 cubic meters of enclosed space, and within 3 hours the interior temperature stabilized at 32 degrees. Victor slept 8 consecutive hours, his rest interrupted only by dreams of Swedish forests and the muffled roar of wind passing harmlessly 6 feet above his head. The performance difference fascinated Robert McKinnon when both men compared experiences at Henderson's 3 days later. Frank showed the exhaustion of sleep deprivation and constant physical labor, his eyes red from smoke exposure, his movements carrying the weariness of a man who'd burned 2,400 calories maintaining shelter and fire. Victor emerged from his experience rested, having expended 1,200 calories digging then sleeping, his face showing only slight reddening from wind exposure during construction. Mac began asking technical questions about cold air drainage and thermal mass, his Scottish practicality recognizing efficiency when he saw it. Jean-Paul Duchesne had secretly practiced pit construction on his trapline, though he told no one for fear of Frank's judgment. But Frank Whitmore doubled down on experience over theory. "You got lucky with a mild blow, Victor," he said, lighting his pipe with hands that still trembled slightly from exhaustion. "Real blizzard would bury you alive in that hole." The debate at Henderson's divided the community between those who trusted traditional methods and those beginning to wonder if Victor's Scandinavian background had taught him something the frontier had forgotten. Old-timer Tom Harkness recalled a trapper found frozen in a snow cave back in 1932, his corpse discovered in spring still sitting upright as if sleeping. Victor explained patiently that caves without proper ventilation filled with carbon dioxide from breathing, while his pits included an air hole through the roof that created natural circulation through temperature differential. The distinction seemed technical, academic, the kind of science talk that didn't matter when you were fighting for your life in a whiteout. By early February, the weather patterns grew increasingly unstable, warm days followed by sudden pressure drops that made experienced trappers exchange worried glances. Cree guide Samuel Crow told anyone who'd listen that the air felt wrong, like it had before the long storm of 1943 that killed 6 men across 2 territories. On February 8th, an unusually warm day, reaching 15 above zero, gave way to rapidly falling barometric pressure. Victor checked his emergency gear methodically, his folding snow saw, collapsible shovel, and probe pole arranged in his pack with the precision of a man who understood that survival began with preparation. Frank checked his 3 waterproof match containers, his hatchet blade, and the fire starter bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Both men trusted their methods completely. February 16th arrived with Victor and Jean-Paul departing for separate 4-day trap circuits, the barometer reading 29.2 inches and falling like a stone dropped down a well. February 18th at 2 in the afternoon, the temperature dropped from 5 below to 35 below in less than 2 hours. Wind that had been blowing 15 miles per hour accelerated to 65 sustained, with gusts reaching 90 that sounded like freight trains tearing through the forest. Visibility collapsed to nothing beyond 18 inches, a complete whiteout where a man couldn't see his own hand held at arm's length. Viktor Bergström stood 22 miles from the nearest cabin, 8 miles separated from Jean-Paul on the sprawling trapline, when he recognized the signs his Sami teachers had burned into his memory. The pressure in his ears, the way snow crystals transformed from soft flakes to needle-sharp particles, the deepening roar that meant the killing cold had arrived. Victor's response came with the calm of practiced procedure. He stood on an exposed ridge with 3 feet of snow base, conditions that would kill an unprepared man in hours. At 2:15, he began cutting snow blocks with his folding saw, working methodically despite wind that threatened to knock him sideways with each gust. He built a windbreak first, stacking blocks in a crescentic wall, then excavated downward into the dense snowpack. His hands moved with precision learned through repetition, each cut measured, each block placed according to geometry that his ancestors had refined when Rome was still a republic. 2 hours and 15 minutes later, at 4:30, Victor climbed down into a 7-foot pit and sealed the entrance behind him. The wind roar became muffled like distant ocean waves, and his body heat began its slow work of warming 8 cubic meters of air trapped inside walls of crystallized water. 8 miles southwest, Jean-Paul Duchesne attempted Victor's method, but panic seized him as wind velocity increased. The young trapper's hands shook as he tried to cut blocks, his measurements going crooked, his confidence evaporating like breath in the murderous cold. He abandoned the half-dug pit and fell back on Frank Whitmore's training, searching desperately for a dense spruce grove that could provide framework for a lean-to. Jean-Paul found his trees by 5 o'clock and began the frantic work of gathering deadwood, discovering the fatal flaw in fire-based survival when conditions turned extreme. Everything was coated in ice. His matches sputtered and died in the wind. On his 5th attempt, hands numb and fumbling, he finally coaxed a small flame to life in a sheltered depression between roots. The first night revealed survival as a battle of mathematics and physics. Victor's pit maintained 31 degrees from body heat alone, the wind completely blocked by 6 feet of snow above his sleeping platform. He slept 6 hours straight, waking only once to check that his ventilation hole remained clear, then drifting back into rest that let his body conserve precious calories. Jean-Paul's lean-to held 18 degrees with the fire burning, dropping to 20 below whenever flames died to coals every 90 minutes. Sleep became impossible. The roar of wind through spruce branches sounded like rifle shots as limbs cracked under ice weight, and Jean-Paul fed his fire continuously, watching his carefully gathered woodpile shrink with terrifying speed. By dawn of the second day, he'd burned 5,300 calories gathering fuel, chopping frozen wood, and shivering through the night, while Victor had used only 2,500, resting in stable cold. February 19th brought conditions that old-timers would talk about for decades. 42 below zero, with wind chill reaching 75 below. Snow accumulating 8 inches every hour. Total darkness at noon from the density of falling crystals. Victor's pit now lay buried under 3 feet of new snow, requiring 20 minutes of careful excavation to clear his entrance tunnel and check the ventilation hole. He ate pemmican, 4,500 calories of concentrated fat and protein, melting snow in his mouth for water. His routine continued with mechanical precision, isometric exercises every 2 hours to maintain circulation, brief ventures outside to manage the entrance, then returned to the stable 30-degree environment his body heat sustained. Jean-Paul's firewood exhausted by noon. Desperate, he began burning equipment, breaking his snowshoe for fuel, and destroying his only means of efficient travel. Early frostbite whitened his fingers from constant exposure while tending flames. At 3 in the afternoon, hypothermia began its insidious work, confusion and fumbling replacing clear thought as his core temperature dropped. Jean-Paul made the fatal mistake of falling asleep beside his dying fire. When he woke at 6, his core temperature had fallen to 94 degrees. The fire was completely dead, and his numb fingers couldn't strike a match. In desperation, the young trapper attempted to walk toward Victor's last known position. He made it 400 yards, before collapsing in a drift at 7:30, his body surrendering to cold that no amount of experience or courage could overcome. Victor remained unaware 8 miles away, his pit performance unchanging, temperature steady at 32 degrees, his physical condition strong, while Jean-Paul lay dying in the darkness and wind. February 21st. At 8 in the morning, the wind finally dropped to 25 miles per hour, and temperature rose to 28 below as the storm system began its slow release of the Manitoba interior. Visibility improved to 100 yards through breaks in the blowing snow, enough for Mac and Frank to organize a search party of 6 men pulling emergency sleds. Nobody spoke the word rescue. After 3 days, in conditions that had killed 31 people during the Great Storm of 1885, the assumption was simple. They were recovering bodies, not survivors. Victor emerged from his pit at 10:30 after 90 minutes of excavating through 5 feet of consolidated snow that had drifted and compressed above his chamber. His physical condition shocked the search party when they found him walking toward Jean-Paul's last known position. Strong, alert, his face showing only slight whitening on nose and cheeks from minor frostbite, Victor moved with the steady gait of a rested man. He'd consumed 9,000 of his 12,000 calories carried, his mental state clear enough to navigate using trapline knowledge and wind pattern memory. Frank Whitmore stared at the Swedish trapper as if seeing a ghost walk out of a grave. "Impossible," Frank said, his voice barely audible over the remaining wind. "Nobody survives 3 days in that without fire." Victor led them to Jean-Paul at 11:45, using calculations about drift patterns and the young trapper's likely path. They found him buried in snow 400 yards from the destroyed lean-to, his core temperature at 86 degrees, unconscious but technically alive, in the way a body clings to function even as systems begin shutting down. Severe frostbite had blackened 3 fingers on his right hand, 2 toes, and 1 ear. Frank immediately began calling for fire, insisting rapid warming was Jean-Paul's only chance. Victor stopped him with quiet authority that came from watching Sammy Elders treat cold injuries for 12 years. "Rapid heat causes shock," Victor said, already unpacking his folding saw. "Pit warming is gradual, safe. Fire will kill him faster than the cold." Max sided with Victor, despite Frank's sputtering protests, pointing at the Swedish trapper, who stood as living proof that traditional knowledge could trump frontier experience. Victor constructed an emergency warming pit in 75 minutes, his movements efficient even after 3 days of survival. They placed Jean-Paul inside with Victor providing body heat, and over 4 hours, the young man's core temperature rose slowly and safely. 86 degrees to 89, then 92. Each degree gained without the catastrophic shock that rapid rewarming would have triggered. When Dr. Harrison arrived from the PAS 2 days later, summoned by emergency radio, his diagnosis confirmed Victor's intuition. Gradual rewarming saved his life, the doctor explained to the assembled trappers. Frozen extremities with rapid heat causes blood vessels to rupture. The pit became a medical chamber, not just shelter. Jean-Paul lost 3 fingers and 1 toe to amputation, permanent reminders of fire methods' failure, but he lived. The Trading Post gathering on February 22nd felt more like a wake for assumptions than a celebration of survival. Frank Whitmore stood before 20 trappers and spoke words that clearly cost him something deep. "I was wrong," he said simply. 25 years of experience, and Victor's method isn't crazy, it's superior. Mac provided technical analysis that everyone could understand, pointing out fatal flaws in fire-based survival that generations had simply accepted as unavoidable. Tom Harkness, who'd spent 50 years in the territories, admitted that the man frozen in a snow cave back in 1932 had died from poor design and carbon dioxide buildup, not from the concept itself. Viktor explained his survival timeline with the patience of a teacher who knew his students were finally ready to learn. 68 hours in the pit, temperature between 28 and 32 degrees consistently, only 6,400 calories expended over 3 full days. He'd performed 4.5 hours of digging and maintenance total, while sleeping 18 hours of genuine rest. Jean-Paul's fire method had collapsed after 29 hours, burning 10,100 calories in just 2 days, with zero sleep and complete exhaustion. The young trapper had emerged with permanent injuries and near-death hypothermia. Viktor had emerged ready to search for his partner, equipment intact, body functional, mind clear. Frank asked the technical questions everyone wanted answered. Viktor demonstrated with his weathered hands how the angled entrance prevented heat loss, how cold air sank below the sleeping platform, how body heat alone could sustain life when the geometry was correct and the snow quality right. Sami knowledge, Viktor said quietly. 10,000 years tested. Not foolish, just foreign to men who forgot how their own ancestors survived before steel and matches existed. The transformation in that room was visible, measurable, as immediate as the temperature difference between Viktor's pit and Jean-Paul's failed lean-to. March 1952 brought transformation that rippled outward from the PA, like cracks spreading through lake ice. All 23 trappers in the region began weekly pit-building practice. Their movements awkward at first, as men accustomed to axes and fire learned the precise geometry of snowblock construction. Viktor conducted 6 training sessions at Henderson's trading post, his patient instruction turning theoretical knowledge into practical skill that could save lives when the next killing storm arrived. The Hudson's Bay Company requested formal documentation of the technique, recognizing that reduced trapper deaths meant better business and fewer widows seeking compensation. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police Survival Training Division sent Sergeant William Crawford north to learn directly from the Swedish immigrant, whose strange method had proven itself in the harshest possible test. Robert McKinnon provided the first successful field application on March 15th, when an unexpected spring storm caught him 12 miles from shelter. Mac constructed his pit in 85 minutes despite 18 below temperatures and 40-mile-per-hour winds, his hands remembering the sequence Viktor had drilled into every student. He survived 14 hours in complete comfort, emerging without incident to report that the experience felt like sleeping in a cold bedroom rather than freezing in an inadequate tent. The community's confidence surged with Mac's success, proving the technique worked for practitioners beyond Viktor's expert execution. Frank Whitmore's public endorsement arrived in April through a detailed article for Northern Trapper magazine titled, "The Swedish Method That Saved My Partner's Life." Frank's confession carried the weight of humility earned through near catastrophe. 25 years of experience made me arrogant and wrong, he wrote, explaining thermal mass and air stratification with the enthusiasm of a convert who'd seen the light after decades in darkness. His article reached 4,000 trappers across Canada and Alaska, spreading Viktor's Sami knowledge through communities that had never heard of Scandinavian survival techniques. By summer, RCMP Sergeant Crawford had created a standardized training manual, complete with step-by-step diagrams, common mistakes highlighted in red ink, and temperature charts that showed why the physics worked. The manual reached 47 RCMP detachments across Northern Territories by September. The winter of 1952 to 1953 provided brutal testing conditions that validated Viktor's method beyond any remaining doubt. Temperatures dropped to 50 below 03 separate times, and major blizzards struck in November, January, and March. 89 documented emergency pit uses occurred across northern Manitoba, and the survival rate told a story that frontier pride could no longer dismiss. 0 fatalities among trained trappers compared to historical averages of 2 to 3 deaths per severe winter. 12 serious situations where pit construction prevented hypothermia that would have killed men relying on fire and lean-to methods. Frank's own emergency use came during a December blizzard that trapped him for 36 hours, and he emerged healthy, rested, and permanently converted to Viktor's approach. Manitoba's Department of Natural Resources mandated pit training for all new trapping licenses by January 1953, requiring physical demonstration of technique before issuing permits. Viktor found himself hired as a consultant at $150 per month, significant income that recognized the value of knowledge he'd offered freely after Jean-Paul's rescue. Training expanded beyond trappers to mining camps, geological survey teams, and military units stationed in the north. 340 people received instruction in the first year, each one learning that snow could be shelter more effective than wood and fire combined. The statistical comparison became undeniable through careful record keeping. Historical data from 1930 to 1951 showed fire-based emergency shelters achieving 62% survival rates in storms lasting 3 days or longer, with survivors typically suffering moderate to severe frostbite. The new pit-based approach achieved 98% survival in comparable conditions with minimal frostbite, using equipment weighing 3 to 4 pounds instead of 12 to 15. Energy expenditure dropped from 8,000 to 12,000 calories per 3 days, down to 6,000 to 7,000. The difference between arriving at the next cabin exhausted or ready to continue working. University of Manitoba engineering professors studied the thermodynamics and confirmed Viktor's intuitive design matched optimal mathematical models for passive thermal regulation. By winter 1954, the pit method had become standard protocol across the Canadian North, with equipment manufacturers producing specialized folding snow saws designed specifically for emergency shelter construction. Young trappers called it the Swedish method, or Viktor's pit, with the reverence reserved for techniques that separated living from dying. Jean-Paul Duchesne, recovered but missing 3 fingers on his right hand, became the method's most vocal advocate. Viktor's crazy pit saved my life twice, he told anyone who'd listen. Once from freezing, once from my own ignorance about what real survival knowledge looked like. The long-term results emerged with the clarity of ice forming on still water. Between 1954 and 1960, northern Canada trapper fatalities and severe winter events dropped 73% compared to the previous decade's averages. The 1956 blizzard struck with intensity comparable to the storm that nearly killed Jean-Paul, and 11 trappers used emergency pits to survive conditions that would have claimed multiple lives just 5 years earlier. 0 deaths occurred. The previous comparable storm in 1947 had killed 4 men and left 9 with serious injuries requiring amputation or extended hospitalization. Hudson's Bay Company insurance costs dropped 40% due to reduced accident claims. And in 1958, Viktor Bergström received the Queen Elizabeth II Certificate of Bravery for contributions to wilderness safety that had saved an estimated 80 lives in 6 years. The Canadian Armed Forces adopted pit construction for Arctic training during the 1960s, recognizing that modern military personnel needed ancient survival knowledge for northern deployment. NATO cold weather survival manuals included Viktor's method by 1965, spreading SAMI techniques through alliance countries that had never heard of Swedish immigrants or Manitoba trap lines. The Royal Canadian Geographical Society documented the technique in 1967 for historical preservation, understanding that Indigenous and immigrant knowledge often disappeared when the generation that carried it died. Mountain rescue organizations across Scandinavia, Canada, and Alaska standardized training around thermal pit construction by 1970. Conservative estimates suggested the technique had saved 180 lives in documented cases between 1952 and 1975, with countless others surviving situations they never reported to authorities. Scientific validation arrived through controlled studies that transformed folklore into physics. The University of Alaska Fairbanks conducted laboratory experiments in 1983, subjecting test volunteers to simulated blizzard conditions at 40 below zero with 60-mile-per-hour winds. Participants in snow pits maintained core temperatures averaging 2.8 degrees higher than those in fire-based shelters, while burning 43% fewer calories and achieving 67% better sleep quality measured through EEG readings and cortisol level analysis. The numbers confirmed what trappers had known empirically for 30 years. Viktor's crazy pit worked because thermal dynamics didn't care about cultural assumptions or frontier pride. Historical research revealed that Viktor hadn't invented anything at all. He'd preserved and transmitted knowledge that cultures across the Arctic had refined independently through millennia of survival necessity. Inuit Iglooit used identical thermal principles, with L-shaped entrance designs. Sami-Goati snow variants appeared in documents from the 1600s, showing the same geometry Viktor had demonstrated in 1951. Siberian Evenki hunters, Swiss alpine rescue teams, and Norwegian mountain guides had all developed nearly identical techniques, their methods converging on the same physics that governed heat retention and air circulation in frozen environments. The lesson wasn't that Viktor was brilliant. The lesson was that 10,000 years of human experience had already solved problems that 1950s trappers thought required modern innovation. Viktor continued working his trap lines until 1968, retiring at age 63 after training an estimated 800 people personally and consulting on 14 search and rescue operations. He died in 1979 at 74. His obituary in the Toronto Globe and Mail reading Swedish trapper whose crazy methods saved hundreds. Jean-Paul Duchesne, interviewed for a 1995 documentary at age 67, held up his three-fingered right hand and laughed. "I lost these but gained my life and wisdom," he said. "Frank taught me to survive with fire. Viktor taught me to survive with physics. Every winter, I think, Viktor's crazy idea is why I'm alive, to see my grandchildren play in snow that used to terrify me." Modern applications continue validating ancient principles. Canadian Rangers, U.S. Alaska military units, and Norwegian Army Arctic battalions require snow pit construction as mandatory training, with an estimated 45,000 military personnel learning the technique between 1952 and present day. Wilderness education programs including NOLS and Outward Bound teach Viktor's geometry to thousands of students annually. YouTube instruction videos have accumulated 2.3 million views across various channels, spreading Sami knowledge to survival enthusiasts who've never experienced Manitoba winters or met Swedish immigrants. The physical evidence remains preserved at the original site near the paths, marked by a historic plaque installed in 1988, with Viktor's folding snowsaw displayed at the RCMP Heritage Center as testament to how simple tools and sophisticated knowledge saved lives that matches and axes could not. The University of Manitoba's 2015 meta-analysis examined 230 winter survival incidents from 1920 to 2015, comparing outcomes before and after Viktor's technique spread. The statistical significance measured p less than 0.001. Overwhelming evidence that pit-based shelters achieved 96% survival rates versus 68% for fire-based methods in extended blizzards. The conclusion stated plainly what trappers had learned through frozen fingers and near-death experiences. Traditional knowledge, when properly understood, often exceeds modern improvisation. A 2019 CBC retrospective titled When immigrants taught Canadians to survive Canada, examined the broader pattern of native and immigrant wisdom, dismissed then validated, from indigenous fire management to traditional medicine, sustainable harvesting to navigation without instruments. Frank Whitmore's legacy quote, recorded in 1975 shortly before his death, captured the transformation that Victor's crazy pit had forced upon an entire community. I had 25 years' experience doing it wrong, Frank said. Victor had 10,000 years of ancestors doing it right. And I was too proud to see the difference, until Jean-Paul almost died for my teaching. The reversal was complete and permanent. What began as Scandinavian foolishness became required knowledge. What seemed like digging your own grave proved to be building your salvation. Modern survival instructors teach the principle that Victor demonstrated through quiet persistence and life-saving results. The most dangerous thing in wilderness survival isn't the blizzard. It's the certainty that your way is the only way. In 2023, a Canadian Ranger trainee emerged from a snow pit in northern Manitoba, temperature at 38 below with 45-mile-per-hour winds, and spoke words that would have made Victor smile. 70 years later, Victor's crazy pit still works. Her instructor's response echoed across decades of hard-won wisdom. Not crazy, never was. Just foreign to people who forgot how their own ancestors survived before we convinced ourselves that modern meant better.